Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. Like many leaders during World War II, Adolf Hitler served in World War I. It was an important part of his identity, and prior to his rise to power in Germany, he even went to court to defend his service record. His detractors claimed that he was a rear area hog, and they argued that he had dodged service in the Austro-Hungarian army and then spent World War I in the German army in the relative safety of his regimental headquarters. Hitler won his court case, but what do we know about his war service? And like the other future World War II leaders, how did the crucible of World War I shape him? To discuss Hitler's service in World War I, we are joined today by Bob Carruthers, author of Private Hitler's War, 1914 to 1918. Welcome, sir, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invite.
Why don't you start us off with a biographical sketch of Hitler leading up to World War I?
Yes, Hitler had a very difficult upbringing. His father was a Louis Hitler, who had been a customs officer and who retired in 1895. A Louis was a very aggressive, a bullying father, which didn't help. And Hitler's mother, Clara, was actually a Louis's third wife. Together they had 6 children. And unfortunately, 3 of those children died in infancy. So Hitler grew up with mortality confronting him. Louis had also tried unsuccessfully to establish himself as a businessman. He wanted to be a bee farmer, and he was unsuccessful in that. But we do hear a lot about Louis beating Hitler. So obviously that shaped a difficult childhood. Hitler had very few academic prospects. Louis was desperate for Hitler to follow in his footsteps and become a customs officer, which Hitler clearly didn't want to do. He always considered himself to be an artist and to be cut out to be a great artist. In consequence, his upbringing was marked by conflict with Alois, who wanted Hitler to stick in at school and become a civil servant. It was for that reason, eventually, that Hitler, when Louis died, decided that the time had come for him to move to Vienna and enroll in art school. Unfortunately, he was unsuccessful in that, so he never became the great artist that he always felt himself to be. In Vienna, he made a hand-to-mouth living by painting postcards, and he used various agents to sell these paintings. But it was very much a hand-to-mouth form of existence. Eventually, the money ran out for him, and that was the point where he decided to move from Austria back to Germany and on to Munich.
So how does he react to the start of World War I, and why does he end up in the German army and not the Austro-Hungarian army?
Well, Hitler lived in inside the border of Germany from the age of 3. And as a result of that, he'd picked up the Munich dialect, the Bavarian way of talking, as opposed to an Austrian dialogue. So when he moved back to Vienna, he was called up for conscription. There's a great deal of people who say he didn't want to join the Austro-Hungarian army, but he did. I think the truth is he simply failed the medical. He'd lived a very hand-to-mouth, difficult existence. He was probably malnourished, and he wasn't a great physical specimen. In consequence, when he turned up at the recruiting office, they just said, he's not the guy for us. So it's as simple and prosaic as that. Hitler was someone who was passionate about the idea of the greater Germany. He wasn't interested in Germans being split into Austria and Germany and all the other territories, and that obviously marked his later thinking. So, in consequence, when the war is declared, he was delighted to be able to squeeze himself into the ranks of the Imperial German army. He shouldn't have been able to do that because, as an Austrian citizen, he should have been in the Austrian army. But the fact that he had this Bavarian accent, and once you're in the ranks of an army, it's very hard to get out of that army. So he was quite pleased. He thought he was fighting for the greater German Reich. And for that reason, he was very, very comfortable in the ranks of the army, the List Regiment. And he called it the best time of his life ever.
Now, he enlists in August 1914, and then by October, he's in combat. So, can you tell us about his first experience of combat?
His first experience of combat was against the British Army. And one of the factors of the British armies at that time, they were all volunteers. There were no conscripts. It was a smallish army, but very, very highly trained. And as such, their marksmanship was good, their elan was good, and they put up a tremendous resistance against Hitler's army, which greatly impressed him at the time.
So, after this first period in combat, does he distinguish himself? Is he well liked by his fellow soldiers?
I'm not sure he would be well liked by his fellow soldiers. He actually had a dog during his time of service, and he was closer to his dog than anyone. But I think this is an interesting thing about Hitler. You have to realise that he thought in big terms. He thought about the German Reich, and he saw it as his duty to do his military service to the utmost. So he was unusual in that respect because most soldiers, as you know, want to do as little as they can. Hitler was determined to do his duty at all costs. People often say he was a backroom malingerer. He wasn't. He had a very, very difficult job. He was a runner taking messages to the front line and back, which was a highly exposed position. In consequence, he was wounded, but he saw himself as being absolutely dedicated to his military service. He was so dedicated, in fact, that he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, which was really unusual because a lowly soldier of his rank, he was a Gefreiter, which is kind of a lance corporal, but not quite. So they were typically, Iron Cross First Class was awarded to the officers, and clearly Hitler wasn't an officer. So he did his duty intensely and passionately. We know from later life that he could speak for 4 hours at a stretch. And I don't think he made a great deal of friends in the trenches. Who wants to listen to somebody espouse their ideas for 4 hours a stretch? So I think he was very much a loner, but people knew they could rely on him to do his duty. So you had that benefit. And I think that's why he was well respected by his officers and those around him, although they didn't necessarily want to spend a lot of time in a dugout with Hitler.
Many young men on both sides of the war were initially very excited to prove themselves in combat. Most, I think, get over that fairly quickly, though, after their first experience of the battlefield. How does Hitler's view of the war evolve? Is he similar to many of those young men, or is he different?
Hitler is completely different. I suppose you could say he marched to the beat of a different drummer. Soldiers hate war. They want to get home. They want to get it over with. He was different. He wanted to do his duty, and he saw his own individual contribution as contributing to that great victory that he always felt was possible and within Germany's grasp.
Now, you mentioned he's fighting against the British earlier, and later he'll obviously come into contact with the French as well. So, does the war give him lasting impressions of what he sees as maybe the national character of the British or the national character of the French?
Yeah, he was also present at Vimy Ridge, which was famously the Canadians that he fought up, and he had a lot of admiration for the dogged quality of the Canadians. There is a tale that Hitler went out into no man's land and came back with 6 French prisoners, which would suggest he had a lower estimation of the French quality. It's hard to find the exact references for that, Whether he actually did or whether it was a later piece of propaganda, we're not so sure. But as you can see in World War II, Hitler always considered the French to be an inferior fighting force. They'd been defeated by the Prussians in 1874, and he felt that the victory he felt was coming in World War I would be easily within their grasp.
Do we know if he had any thoughts about the Americans entering the war?
Well, by the time the Americans entered the war in 1917, Hitler was just about to be wounded. He was gassed, and he ended up the Great War actually in hospital. So he never really came to grips with the American forces and couldn't really form a view. By that time, he was hospitalized and in danger of losing his sight.
So that brings me to my next question then. Can you tell us about his reaction to the end of the war?
The end of the war was something that was incredibly formative for Hitler. And there had been a major German offensive called the Kaiserschlacht in 1918, which took the German army towards what he considered the ultimate victory. But Hitler felt, as did many in the trenches, the German trenches, they'd been stabbed in the back. This was the famous Durchschluss. There was a revolution in the navy, and the soldiers felt they could have achieved a victory, but they were stabbed in the back by the politicians and the people at home. They were deprived of what he saw was an imminent victory. And I think that is one of the reasons why he felt so strongly that he could succeed in World War II. He was often called a corporal. He wasn't even a corporal, but it shaped his feeling that World War II could provide a German victory that they'd been waiting on for so long. It's interesting as well because Russia in the First World War wasn't a great force. It was considered an easy assignment to be on the Russian front because by 1917, the Russian army collapsed. So again, that was a very important formative view for the Second World War, where Hitler felt that Russia would be something of a soft touch.
One of the big questions about Hitler is where and when was he radicalized? And do you think his military service in the First World War helps answer this question?
Probably not. I mean, for me, I think you have to go back to Vienna because there was a mayor called Luger who hated Jews and the whole idea of Jewry. So for that reason, Hitler was impressed by the literature that was around in Vienna, by the attitude of this horribly racist mayor constantly being re-elected. Hitler admired this guy and he picked up on the racist traps at the time. So I think his time in Vienna, people need to look a lot more closely at that because I think Luger was the reason why he became so radicalized.
Does later Nazi propaganda accurately portray his World War I military service?
Well, he did go to court and fight in an ordinary court of law to prove that he had been a loyal, dedicated soldier. And I think there's no way around it. That was true. He was awarded Iron Cross First Class, which was not given to the ordinary lower soldiers. Whether it made him popular with his colleagues, I'm not so sure, but he definitely served with absolute intense dedication.
But you don't think there was ever an effort to perhaps exaggerate some of that to an even greater level?
Particularly, I mean, the regimental histories hardly mention him. So that there wasn't an idea of portraying him as a great war hero. We keep coming back to this fact that he was only a Gefreiter, which is a kind of trusted soldier who didn't have to do sentry duty and things. So to undertake a very, very difficult job, to be wounded and then gassed, I don't think they did exaggerate his service. I think he was a totally dedicated to an almost insane level to do his duty.
Any final thoughts on Hitler in World War I?
I think the reason that we did the book, we were making a series for Discovery Channel. And what I really thought was interesting was how suburban and how ordinary all the places that shaped Hitler's life were. It's fairly easy to go back to Austria and to Germany and to visit almost every place where he lived, where he had his beer hall push, where he liked to be in the mountains. So I would encourage people, if they didn't have the Atlantic in the way, to go and see for themselves just how ordinary and how mundane a lot of these places actually are. And surprisingly, almost everywhere is still there. You can go to the pub that a Lewis liked to drink in. You can go to the beer hall where the pooch was. I would really encourage people to kind of go in the footsteps. The book's not a travelogue, but it was easy to do. And it's a tremendously rewarding thing to do for people who are interested in the history of the 21st century.
I think that's one of the things that struck me about the book, is that his experiences, for the most part, aren't too terribly different than that of maybe many other veterans. I mean, different job, maybe exposed to a little more danger than your average soldier. But I think sometimes we're always looking for something really crazy and really different that happened to him.
Yeah.
And yet World War I, his experience is very much like others. He just has a different maybe attitude than your average soldier to what's going on.
I think it's very important to try and strip away this idea that the man is a monster. He's clearly not a caricature. He's shaped by his early influences. He's shaped by the mortality in his family. His father dies in 1903. His mother dies in 1907. He feels he's going to be a great painter, and actually he ends up painting postcards and trying to sell them to get by, and he ends up in a doss house. So he wasn't marked for greatness, but out of the turmoil of the Great War, where he feels he was stabbed in the back, that's the impetus that makes him a politician.
Thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing your research on Hitler and World War I.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet with you.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.